In 1922, in a small examination room in Danbury, Connecticut, a Harvard physician named Alice Hamilton watched a 19-year-old hat factory apprentice try and fail 3 times to hold a cup of coffee steady enough to drink from it. He had been working with Mercury for less than 2 years. Of the 100 union hatters Hamilton and her colleagues examined that year, 43 already showed unmistakable signs of mercury poisoning. Boys barely out of their teens whose hands now shook constantly, and men only a few years further into the trade who could no longer feed themselves without help. Nobody who ever picked up a mercury-soaked brush to treat a piece of rabbit fur set out to do any of this. And yet that trade eventually left the English language with a permanent idiom for madness, left the riverbed of a Connecticut town measurably poisoned more than a century later, left a former factory site sitting today under a federal Superfund designation, and left tens of thousands of documented disabling cases spread across 2 continents and roughly 250 years, all traceable back to a single practical discovery about how to soften rabbit fur. This was not a rare accident or a single factory's failure. It was the ordinary, expected outcome of a felt-making process that had already been quietly disabling hat workers for close to 250 years by the time Hamilton walked into that room, a process so widespread and so consistently damaging that it had given the English language one of its most enduring idioms for madness itself: mad as a hatter. Think about that for a second. An entire, everyday figure of speech, one people still use casually today without a second thought, exists because an entire profession spent centuries being visibly, publicly poisoned in plain sight, and the rest of society simply folded that poisoning into a joke about eccentric behavior rather than recognizing it as an industrial catastrophe. 22,000 American hat workers were still on the job when the government finally acted in the 1930s. Picture a mid-sized American town today, every single working adult in it, and roughly 1 in 10 of them slowly losing control of their own hands and their own minds for a paycheck. But the mercury that ruined those young men's hands in 1922 had nothing to do with any dramatic industrial accident. It traced back to an almost unbelievable act of medical coincidence roughly 2.5 centuries earlier in the workshops of 17th century France, and to a decision so small that whoever made it could never have imagined it would eventually poison an entire industry on 2 continents. Felt hats had been made in Europe for centuries before mercury ever entered the process. Fur, most often from rabbits, hares or beavers, had to be separated from the skin and roughened at the fiber level so it would mat together evenly under heat and pressure, a step hatters called felting. For most of that history, the fur was simply soaked in urine, human or animal, whose natural acidity helped loosen the fibers. It was an unglamorous but unremarkable trade secret, the kind of small, practical detail that never made it into any official record. Then, sometime in the 1600s, French hatters began to notice that felt produced by one particular workman in their trade was consistently smoother, glossier, and easier to work than anyone else's. The explanation, once it emerged, was almost absurd. The man was being treated for syphilis with a mercury compound at the time, a completely standard medical treatment in that era, and traces of that mercury were passing into his urine and from there into the fur he treated. Mercury, it turned out, was even more effective than plain urine at breaking down the fur's structure. Mercury-based syphilis treatment was, at the time, so common across Europe that a popular saying held a night with the goddess of love was followed by a lifetime with the god of the same metal used in thermometers. Doctors rubbed mercury ointment onto patients' skin, injected mercury compounds directly into their bodies, and prescribed mercury pills to be swallowed, all in the sincere, mistaken belief that the same substance now known to be a potent neurotoxin was a legitimate cure. That one workman's treatment, in other words, was not some strange medical outlier. It was simply ordinary 17th century medicine applied to an ordinary patient who happened to also work with fur. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Word spread through French hatting circles, and within a generation, workshops across the country had abandoned plain urine altogether in favor of a deliberately mixed solution of mercuric nitrate and nitric acid brushed directly onto the fur in a step that came to be called carroting, named for the distinctive orange-red tint the mercury solution left behind. By the late 1600s, French Huguenots fleeing religious persecution carried the technique across the English Channel into Britain, and from Britain in the following century, it crossed the Atlantic into the hat-making towns of colonial and early industrial America. For roughly the next 300 years, mercuric nitrate carroting became the standard, near-universal method of producing high-quality fur felt anywhere in the Western world. It was not a shortcut used by careless manufacturers. It was simply how the industry made hats, taught openly from master to apprentice, written into trade manuals, embedded so completely into the craft that generations of hatters could not have imagined making felt any other way. By the early 1700s, English felt-making towns were already showing signs of an occupational condition nobody yet understood. Workers developed a fine, involuntary tremor that began in the fingers and, in advanced cases, spread to the eyelids, lips, and tongue, until simply walking across a workshop floor required a colleague to guide them by the arm. Alongside the physical tremor came a cluster of behavioral changes: extreme shyness, irritability, social withdrawal, sudden mood swings, and in the most severe cases, hallucinations and delirium. Doctors would eventually give this specific pattern a name of its own, Erethism, from a Greek word meaning irritation, to describe the peculiar mixture of physical trembling and psychological fragility that set mercury poisoning apart from most other industrial diseases. Because the symptoms so closely resembled public drunkenness, staggering gait, slurred speech, trembling hands, employers, and, for generations, much of the public simply assumed hatters were unusually prone to drink. And no, none of this was confined to any one country. The condition followed the trade wherever mercuric nitrate carroting was practiced. In Britain, cases gradually declined toward the turn of the 20th century as informal changes in workshop practice took hold, even without any formal legal ban. In Tuscany, Italy, hatmakers exposed to the same mercury solution were eventually recognized as occupationally injured and received financial compensation for it. Wherever felt hats were made using the mercury method, in other words, the same slow, predictable poisoning followed. A single 17th century French decision replicated, almost identically, in workshop after workshop, country after country, for the better part of 3 centuries. The first person to formally document what was actually happening seems to have worked in St. Petersburg, Russia, describing the condition among hatters there in 1829, the very same year the phrase "mad as a hatter" first began appearing in print in England. Whether the idiom grew directly out of medical observation or out of ordinary folk wisdom about a trade everyone in England already associated with strange, twitchy, withdrawn men is impossible to say for certain. What is certain is that by the time Lewis Carroll gave the world his own hatter in 1865, the association between hat-making and madness was already so entrenched in popular culture that no explanation was needed for readers to understand the joke. By the middle of the 19th century, the trade had crossed the ocean and taken root with extraordinary force in a small Connecticut town. According to local legend, sometime around 1780, a Danbury man named Zadok Benedict discovered, quite by accident, that fur pressed into the sole of his own worn-out shoe had matted into felt through nothing more than sweat and friction. Whether or not that particular story is strictly true, what followed was not in dispute. By 1800, Danbury was producing more hats than any other city in the young United States, and by the 1880s, the town's factories were turning out roughly 5 million hats a year across 56 separate operations. Danbury did not merely have a hat industry. Danbury became, in the phrase locals used with genuine pride, the hat city of the world. 5 million hats a year is difficult to picture in the abstract, so picture it this way instead. That is roughly one new hat leaving Danbury's factories for every single resident of a major American city. Every single year, decade after decade. Waves of immigrant labor drawn by wages that were, by the standards of the era, genuinely competitive, poured into the town to keep pace with that demand. And with them came the same mercury exposure that had already been quietly disabling hatters on the other side of the Atlantic for nearly 200 years. Every one of those millions of hats, for as long as the mercury method remained standard, passed through the same basic sequence. Raw pelts were painted with the orange mercuric nitrate solution and dried in ovens, releasing mercury vapor into the surrounding air even at this early stage. The treated fur was then sliced from the skin, layered onto cone-shaped molds, and repeatedly shrunk with boiling water and steam, a process that drove still more mercury vapor into the humid, poorly ventilated finishing rooms where men worked shoulder to shoulder for 10 and 12 hours at a stretch. The lungs, not the skin, turned out to be the primary route into the body. Mercury vapor passed easily from the warm, moist air of the workroom into the bloodstream, and from there accumulated steadily in the brain, the kidneys, and the nervous system, month after month, year after year, with no dramatic single moment of exposure that anyone could point to and call the cause. The finishing rooms themselves were, by every surviving account, brutal places to spend a working life, even setting the mercury aside. Steam from the shrinking vats kept the air thick and wet year-round. Windows were routinely kept shut to preserve the heat needed for the felting process, and the same orange-tinted mercury vapor that gave carroting its name hung visibly in the air above the workbenches. Hatters joked darkly among themselves about the shakes long before any doctor gave the condition a proper name, because in a workroom where nearly half the men eventually developed some degree of tremor, it was simply impossible not to notice. In 1860, a physician named J. Addison Freeman, practicing in Orange, New Jersey, in the middle of a rapidly growing cluster of hat-making towns, published the first thorough American clinical account of what he called mercurial disease among hatters. Freeman's paper was direct about what needed to change. Workrooms needed to be larger, higher ceilinged and properly ventilated, and if mercury use could not be eliminated altogether, its use needed to be sharply reduced. His warning went almost entirely unheeded by the industry that employed the men he had examined. Over the following decades, the pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. In France, the National Academy of Medicine formally described the health hazards of hat-making in 1869, and it took nearly 3 decades more before a French law finally offered hatters any legal protection, in 1898. In Connecticut, mercury poisoning was formally added to the state's Workmen's Compensation Act in 1913, and the state officially recognized it as a genuine occupational hazard in 1919. And yet recognizing a hazard on paper and actually investigating it were, in practice, 2 entirely separate things. Despite that formal 1919 recognition, Connecticut did not commission an actual government study of conditions inside its own hat factories for another 18 years. A safer alternative to mercuric nitrate had, in fact, already existed for decades by the time that 1919 recognition arrived. A hydrochloride-based felting process was patented in 1888, more than 30 years before Connecticut even acknowledged mercury poisoning as an occupational hazard, and more than half a century before the industry actually stopped using mercury. The patent existed. The alternative was technically available. It simply was not adopted because switching processes cost money, retraining cost money, and the men actually breathing the mercury vapor had no real say in either decision. That gap is exactly where Alice Hamilton's 1922 examination fits. Hamilton, one of the pioneering figures of American industrial medicine and, 3 years earlier, the first woman appointed to the faculty of Harvard Medical School, was not acting on behalf of the state of Connecticut at all. Her investigation and the alarming statistics it produced, 100 hatters examined, 43 already poisoned, was carried out independently and then championed by the Workers' Health Bureau of America, together with the United Hatters Union, in a deliberate campaign to force official attention onto a problem the state itself had already formally acknowledged 3 years earlier, without doing anything meaningfully to address it. Hamilton was not working alone. Grace Mailhouse Burnham, who had helped establish the Workers' Health Bureau in the first place, went looking abroad for a genuine solution rather than simply more documentation of the problem, and identified a non-toxic carroting alternative already in use in the Soviet Union. She could never persuade American hat manufacturers to adopt it. Around the same period, Charles Edward Amory Winslow, a public health researcher at Yale, conducted his own independent study of roughly 100 Danbury hatters as part of a separate workers' compensation legal case, arriving at findings that echoed Hamilton's own. Two respected researchers working through two entirely different channels had now reached the identical conclusion. The industry's answer was to keep manufacturing hats exactly as it always had. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I do, consider hitting subscribe. Every week on this channel, we dig into another profession history quietly built on top of human suffering, jobs that seemed completely ordinary to the people doing them, and turned out to carry a hidden cost nobody had bothered or dared to calculate. Even Hamilton's findings and the union's advocacy campaign were not, by themselves, enough to force real change. Manufacturers and their insurers continued to argue in courtrooms and workers' compensation hearings that the tremors and erratic behavior seen in their workers stemmed from alcohol and tobacco use rather than working conditions, a convenient explanation that shifted blame squarely onto the men who were sick rather than the mercury they breathed every working day. These were not informal accusations made in passing. They were formal legal arguments presented by company lawyers and insurance representatives, specifically designed to defeat individual hatters' compensation claims one case at a time, forcing sick men to prove, individually and repeatedly, what independent researchers had already demonstrated at a population level more than a decade earlier. It took until 1937, 15 years after Hamilton's initial study, for the state of Connecticut and the United States Public Health Service to jointly commission the comprehensive investigation that would ultimately force the industry's hand. Investigators moved through the felt finishing rooms of Danbury and dozens of other hat-making towns across the country, and the final report was unambiguous. Roughly 10% of the estimated 22,000 hat workers then employed across the country showed measurable signs of chronic mercurialism. The report also explicitly and formally rejected the alcohol and tobacco explanation manufacturers had leaned on for decades, stating plainly that the symptoms tracked directly with mercury exposure and nothing else. On the strength of that 1937 report, the United States Public Health Service spent the following years negotiating directly with hatters' unions and manufacturers across 26 separate states where hat factories operated. The resulting tripartite agreement, finalized in 1941, ended the use of mercury in American hat making entirely, replacing it with a hydrogen peroxide-based process that was, as it turned out, both safer and cheaper to run. Connecticut's governor, Robert A. Hurley, formally announced the state's adoption of the ban on December 1, 1941, telling reporters it had proven entirely possible to manufacture good felt hats without turning hundreds of workers into what he bluntly called physical wrecks. There is, however, an uncomfortable detail historians studying the record have pointed to in the years since. The final ban arrived just 6 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States fully into the Second World War, at a moment when the American military's own demand for mercury, an essential ingredient in the fulminate of mercury used to manufacture detonators, was already climbing sharply. Whatever the precise balance of motives inside that 1941 negotiation, and reasonable historians disagree on exactly how much weight to give each factor, it remains a striking fact that 81 years of accumulating medical evidence going all the way back to Freeman's 1860 paper had failed to end the practice, while a competing wartime industrial demand for the same metal succeeded within a matter of months. It is worth sitting with that comparison for a moment. 81 years of published medical warnings, 2 formal government studies, a dedicated industrial hygienists' independent investigation, a union-led national advocacy campaign, and a state law explicitly recognizing the hazard, all of it, combined, took 8 decades to produce a ban. A competing claim on the same raw material, driven by an entirely different set of priorities, appears to have helped settle the matter within a single year. The workers themselves, and the decades of accumulated documentation of their suffering, may well have mattered less to the timing of that final decision than a war on the other side of the world. For years afterward, Danbury's hatters marked December 1st as an informal local holiday, gathering annually to celebrate the day Mercury finally left their trade. But the celebration came very late for an industry that was already fading. Changing fashions, particularly the declining popularity of formal hats as automobiles and other forms of transportation, reduced the practical need for head coverings that shielded riders from open-air weather, had already begun eroding Danbury's dominance decades earlier. Where the town had counted 56 operating hat factories at its Victorian-era peak, only 6 remained by 1923. The very last of them, a Stetson plant, finally closed its doors in 1965, bringing roughly a century and a half of continuous hat-making in Danbury to a quiet, largely unremarked end. The Mercury itself, unlike the industry that once depended on it, did not simply disappear when the factories shut down. Decades' worth of mercury-laden waste had been discharged directly into Danbury's Still River throughout the industry's working life, and it settled into the riverbed sediment, where it has remained ever since. A 4-year study conducted by researchers from the University of Connecticut and Wesleyan University, published in 2020, confirmed that measurable levels of that century-old industrial mercury are still detectable in the river today, continuing to work their way into the local food web through fish and other aquatic life. The land where several of the old factories once stood was formally designated a Federal Superfund cleanup site by the Environmental Protection Agency. In 2003, in one attempt to address the lingering contamination, the state planted genetically engineered eastern cottonwood trees, specifically bred to draw mercury up out of the contaminated soil through their root systems, on one former factory site, a slow, still ongoing remediation effort more than 60 years after the mercury itself stopped being poured into the ground. Danbury's polluted riverbed is, in the end, only one small local chapter of a much larger, ongoing global reckoning with the same metal. In 2013, more than 100 countries formally adopted the Minamata Convention on Mercury, a United Nations treaty named for a Japanese city devastated by industrial mercury poisoning in the 20th century, specifically committing signatory nations to phase out mercury use across a long list of industrial processes worldwide. Felt hat-making does not even appear on that modern list of concerns. It had already been eliminated as a source of mercury exposure decades before the treaty existed. But the underlying pattern, a genuinely useful industrial property of a genuinely toxic metal, adopted first and understood only much later, is exactly the same pattern that quietly disabled Danbury's hatters 2 centuries earlier, playing out again in different industries, in different countries, largely unnoticed by a public that had already forgotten where the phrase "mad as a hatter" came from in the first place. And what of the character whose name gave this entire disease its popular title? Here, the historical record offers one final, almost fitting twist of irony. Despite generations of readers assuming Lewis Carroll's Hatter was a direct literary reference to the real occupational disease devastating hat workers across England at the very moment he was writing, most Carroll scholars now believe the character was actually modelled on a real eccentric Oxford furniture dealer named Theophilus Carter, known locally for his unusual habits and his perpetual top hat, rather than on any specific mercury-poisoned tradesman. The phrase "mad as a hatter" was already common English slang by the time Carroll wrote his book in 1865. But the single most famous embodiment of that phrase in Western literature may, in the end, have almost nothing to do with the actual disease that inspired the phrase in the first place. And no, I'm not making that up. Somewhere along the way, the story people actually remember, a whimsical, fictional tea party quietly replaced the real story. 250 years of documented, entirely preventable industrial poisoning, hiding in plain sight behind a joke so familiar that almost nobody who uses it today has any idea where it truly came from. None of that changes what happened to the men who actually worked the trade. Back in that Danbury examination room in 1922, the 19-year-old Alice Hamilton watched struggling with his coffee cup had, by the most conservative estimates available at the time, at least another decade of hat-making ahead of him if he wanted to keep his job. A decade during which his hands would almost certainly shake more, not less. 19 years old, and already, by any reasonable medical standard of the era, a man whose nervous system had begun failing on the job. He would go on working anyway, because it was the only trade he knew, in the only industry his town had ever really had, making hats that would be worn, admired, and eventually discarded by people who never gave a single thought to how they had been made. He was one of tens of thousands of hatters across 2 continents and roughly 250 years who breathed in a slow, accumulating poison every single working day, doing a job that looked, from the outside, like nothing more dangerous than shaping felt into fashionable hats. Because 2.5 centuries earlier, in a French workshop, one sick man's urine had happened to produce a slightly better batch of felt than anyone else's, and nobody involved could have possibly imagined how far or how long that single coincidence would travel.